So they hedge their stories in all of this obscure symbolism, and they leave it up. Basically, the theory is this: because this knowledge is so profound and so valuable, we're going to make it very difficult for the average person to access. And it's only going to be accessible to somebody who's really committed, who's really dedicated. And so in the Grail literature, you realize you read about whether or not a person is worthy to become a guardian of the Grail. And this is not an easy thing. And to become a guardian of the Grail requires a great deal of commitment, even sacrifice. And so it's the same way with the alchemical literature. The secret of alchemy is the philosopher's stone. And as they say, really, once you understand the process is very simple. It's almost child play. However, that simple process has been buried in all of this obscure symbology. Yeah, I'm going to put my Kabbalah stuff together. I'm going to do this.
Pretty good.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I mean, the main thing I focused on is the gematria, which is the numerical code under the language, and then how that relates to geometry. That's been my focus. So there's a lot of really esoteric branches of Kabbalah, a lot of byways, and that I haven't looked into. I mean, it's a really complex system. So you're interested in the Kabbalah?
Yes, I wanted to know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, well, a lot of speculative stuff about the Holy Grail, that's for sure. Just like there's a lot of speculative stuff about Atlantis. And if we're just talking about historically and what is known, what is the origin of the Grail? Where did it start out from? Historically.
Cut with Jesus, they used the last supper,
They run what they want and then particularly last one. Stuff.
Yeah, see,
it's the Christian code.
right.
Lawrence Gardner says it's long before then.
Yeah, he goes back to the Anunnaki.
Okay, so basically, to put it into context, there's a tradition about the Grail, or the forerunners of it, that go back probably thousands of years. What happened at the dawning of the Christian era was that what had been earlier symbolism, probably of Celts and various pagan groups, was Christianized, was recast in a Christian form. Historic, the Grail emerges in the Middle Ages. You don't find any, reference to the Holy Grail per se prior to the early 1100s. What we have in the 11 and 1200s is the emergence of a whole vast Grail literature that then refers back to the story of the Grail as being associated with the founding of Christianity, being the cup that was used at the Last Supper. All of this is from writings that appeared historically in the Middle Ages. So the question, of course, is that, like with so many things, I'll use them as an example of Freemasonry. Freemasonry has a legendary history that goes back a minimum of 3,000 years to the building of King Solomon's Temple. Historical Masonry goes back to the 900s, the mid-900s. The first actual record of Masonry that there exists anywhere is the initiation of King Athelstan, who was an English king. And it's only a reference to him being initiated into the order of Freemason. So, but that one reference is enough to know that historically the body of Freemasons as an organization existed in the mid-900s. Now, if you go into the lore of Freemasonry, then you're going to be reading stories that go back 2,000 years before that, minimum. And in fact, even the lore of Freemasonry traces its origin back, and this to me is fairly significant to Noah's flood. In fact, there was a whole branch of Freemasonry which has more or less become extinct, but it was called Noachite Masonry, and it was very prevalent back in the 17 and 1800s. And it was essentially a whole Masonic tradition involving the transmission of Masonic mysteries by Noah. That was the legend goes that what he set out specifically to do was to preserve Masonic mysteries from the antediluvian world to the post-diluvian world. There's another Masonic legend about, in some versions it's Lamech, and in other versions it's Enoch, who has foreknowledge of the impending disaster, and he decides to try to preserve a time capsule with the scientific knowledge of his day, of the antediluvian world. So he builds two pillars, pillar of marble and a pillar of brass. And he sets these pillars in an area which now would presume to be Syria or Lebanon, somewhere in there. And the pillar of marble was to withstand fire, and the pillar of brass was to withstand flood. And on the two pillars were carved inscriptions that told how to get to a vault. And the vault was built, an underground vault, and is described in Masonic legends as being 9 chambers, and it depends on how you read the Old English, 9 chambers or 9 stories underground. It's similar in some ways to the story of the founding of the Rosicrucians and the finding of Frater CRC in an underground vault. But the idea was that he inscribed, it sounds almost in a way like a large computer chip, a triangle, and on this triangle is inscribed by some mysterious manner all of the scientific knowledge of his day. In some of the stories it's Lamech, in other of the stories it's Enoch. But in any case, they put this artifact in this chamber and then seal it with 9 layers. And then this is covered over and it's under a hill. The 2 pillars stand to direct the finders, the survivors, to this 9-storied or 9-chambered underground vault or time capsule where this knowledge has been preserved. Now, of course, none of that is historical. It's all purely legendary. Likewise with the Grail. What we have essentially is the Grail was an emergence of something that showed up in literature in the Middle Ages. And when you go through all of that literature, what you discover is that it's dealing with this artifact that was present at the crucifixion. And this is where it was Chrétien de Troyes in the French, who first tied the idea of the Grail with the crucifixion, and the Grail being the cup that was used at the Last Supper, and then was subsequently used by Joseph of Arimathea to collect the blood of Christ. Anything beyond that is speculative. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily true. It's just, at this stage, still speculative. The question of whether there was a bloodline from Jesus is speculative. Some people dismiss it out of hand because it goes against their belief system. Obviously, if you accept the conventional view of mainstream Christianity, there's no room in there for Jesus to have survived the crucifixion or to have spawned children and created a bloodline. And so many people will reject that idea completely out of hand. Others who are not necessarily, who don't know anything to the Christian belief system have, I think, accepted that notion rather uncritically. But in any case, it's possible. It is certainly possible, but I don't think anybody's proven it yet. In the Holy Blood, Holy Grail story, when I don't know if you remember the group in there led by the Frenchmen, who were they called again?
Priori of Scion.
The Priori de Scion, the Priory of Scion, which probably didn't exist, was probably an invention in the early 1900s. That whole thing of the Priory of Scion may have been a hoax.
Plantards.
What?
Plantards.
Plantard, yeah. Plantard, Gerard Plantard, I think it was. There was a group of artists and writers back in the 1920s who got together. There is actually evidence that they got together and planned a hoax, that they were going to create this whole idea of secret documents and bloodline of Christ and all of this, and that the this modern family was descended from the Merovingians. Now, like with a lot of these things, there probably is an element of truth in it. Even though there was a hoax, the hoaxers, see, that's the best hoaxes are the ones that essentially are not completely fabricated, but also mix truth and fabrication together. And that's almost certainly what this was, that level of a hoax. There were Merovingians, and they did have traditions about being descended from Christ. I mean, I think that has been pretty well demonstrated. And in the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they initially endorsed the whole idea of the Priori de Scion and the probable lineage of this Plantard family, or Plantards, descended from that bloodline. If that turned out to be a hoax, that does not necessarily discredit the whole idea that there could have been a bloodline of Jesus. Now, we get into the idea here of clearly when one reads the Grail stories, the references to the blood of Christ are replete. I mean, that seems to be the recurring theme through all of it. When you read the different authors, there's Robert de Boron, there's Wolfram von Eschenbach, there's the anonymous author of Parlez-vous, there's Chrétien de Troyes, there's 4 or 5 others. In the corpus of literature surrounding the Holy Grail are about 10 or 12 works that either to address one aspect of it or another. And when you begin to go through this, and I certainly haven't read it all, but I've read enough of it to appreciate the fact that it's very complex stuff, that what you read in one book is not necessarily going to be exactly confirmed by what you read in another account. It's very much like trying to read the literature of alchemy. If you've ever delved into the literature of alchemy, what you discover is there are so many inconsistencies and contradictions, but see, that's deliberate. It's in alchemy, what they try to do is they'll use the same symbol that'll oftentimes represent different phenomena, which is completely the reverse of the way science, as we know it, is supposed to work, using one symbol to represent different phenomena. On the other hand, they will take one phenomena and use different symbols or different names for it. So it can be very confusing if you don't have the key to make the initial connections. And the way alchemy works is that without the initial key, all the rest of it becomes futile. If you have the initial key, it allows you to make the first couple of connections. And only when you've made those first couple of connections is it then possible to go to the next step. And each step creates the potential of going to the next step. So you have to have it's almost like, very much like, the video games that kids play. You've got to get into a certain room and get a key or some kind of a weapon or some kind of a tool. And until you get that, you're not going to be able to get into the next room or the next chamber. It's very much like that when you're working your way through the literature of alchemy. And the Grail literature is very similar to that. It's when you start reading it, what you'll see is that you go, wait a second. In one of them, it's describing the Grail as a cup. In another one, it's describing it as a dish or a plate. In another one, it refers to it as the blood. In another one, it refers to it as a rock or a stone, and so on. And there will be 6 or 8 different things that it sounds like you're talking about. It's like the word Grail could be 10 different things. If I said the Grail and I was talking about this computer, or then I said the Grail and I was talking about this fan, or then I was talking about the Grail and I meant Charles' left shoe. And after a while, you go, what the hell is he talking about? Which one is it? Well, the analogy that I used, in a discussion that we had about the Grail in here a year or so ago, was this, is that the disparity comes in because what you're doing in the alchemical literature as well as in the Grail literature, what's happening is it's describing different aspects of a machine. It'd be almost like if you went out and described a tire out of rubber, you described its composition of being black and rubber and round and this and that, and then you described the carburetor and what it does, and then you describe, a universal joint, you wouldn't necessarily think from this description of a tire and a universal joint and a carburetor that they really have any relation or connection with each other in any way. But they are components of this larger machine that when it's assembled in a certain way, then it does something. There's an ignition system. You know, and you could describe that ignition system. You could describe the process of internal combustion. You could describe the piston chamber. But without necessarily having the big picture, you wouldn't know how to put these pieces together, and it would make no sense. You would think, what does this round black rubber thing that comes from a tree, what's that got to do with this other thing? Well, the alchemical literature, the Grail literature is very much the same way. It's almost as if we decided in this room, hey, we've got this secret knowledge. Now, here's what we're going to do. We want to preserve this knowledge beyond our lifetime, and it's bigger than any one of us could probably address in one lifetime. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break it up into parts. It's like, here's the set of encyclopedias. And Sam, you're going to get volume 3, and Don's going to get volume 2, and Jerry, you're going to get volume 7, and that's what you've got to work on. And so everybody in here works on a different part of it. Then we send it out into the world, leaving it up to a future generation to get all the separate parts and put it back together. And only when you put all the pieces together, then you get a vehicle that you can actually get in and transport yourself from one place to another. Well, the parallels between Grail literature and the alchemical literature are very, very striking. And you realize that they're kind of coming from the same kind of a mindset. You realize that there's something there that they don't want to reveal too easily and too directly, you know, to the unqualified reader. So they hedge their stories in all of this obscure symbolism, and they leave it up. Basically, the theory is this: because this knowledge is so profound and so valuable, we're going to make it very difficult for the average person to access. And it's only going to be accessible to somebody who's really committed, who's really dedicated. And so in the Grail literature, you realize, you read about whether or not a person is worthy to become a guardian of the Grail. And this is not an easy thing. And to become a guardian of the Grail requires a great deal of commitment, even sacrifice. And so it's the same way with the alchemical literature. The secret of alchemy is the Philosopher's Stone. And as they say, really, once you understand the process is very simple. It's almost child play. However, that simple process has been buried in all of this obscure symbology where a person has to just go through it and spend years trying to sort it all out and then put it all together. Really, it's like if somebody took the car apart and then laid all the pieces out, and then, in fact, hid pieces in different places, just like an Easter egg hunt. And you had to go around and find all the pieces first. Then you lay them out. And then what do you do with it? Well, nothing unless you have a manual that gives you some guidance as to part A goes to part B, and then you put part C to part A and B, and you can reconstruct the model. Well, in the esoteric traditions or in the arcane lore, what we have is we have the instruction manual has been scattered into numerous different avenues. So we have the alchemical tradition on the one hand, and we have the Grail tradition on the other hand. But it doesn't take long of perusing the literature before you realize that they're so similar that they might really be talking about the same thing. When we talk about the Grail and what it does, and for example, its restorative properties, you could take out the word Grail and you could put in the stone or the Philosopher's Stone. And you could take the alchemical literature talking about the Philosopher's Stone, the Grail literature talking about the Sang Graal, and you could swap the two without any loss of meaning whatsoever when it describes one or the other. So I think it's extremely beneficial to study both of them if you're going to try to get into what this is all about. And the other thing is that in the Grail literature, we find that there seems to be different dimensions that it applies to. On the one hand, we have the idea that it might be the bloodline. Well, then what you've got to ask, and that makes sense when you read some of the authors, like when you read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and you read the Grail literature and some of the other commentators, you do realize that there are constant references throughout the literature to blood and to the blood of Christ and so forth. Even though the term sangral can be translated two different ways. The sangral is the Holy Grail, but it's also the royal blood. It can mean the same word literally has both meanings. The Grail, which if you read the origins of the word, which I'm going to show you here in a second, you discover it's got a very specific etymology. And its original meaning is extremely significant, I think, in putting together the final picture of what it is. So you have this reference to the blood and to the bloodline of Christ. But then when you go into the traditions about blood, you discover that, the significance of blood preceded Christ. But it was, again, like so many things at the dawn of the Piscean Age, in the Christian tradition, there was sort of like a reactivation or a reconfiguring of these ancient traditions to make them more digestible or appropriate for the age that was commencing. And so when we look at the Piscean Age 2,000 years ago, we keep that in mind that the symbology that may have existed in ancient Egypt has been recast and reformulated to make it more appropriate for the period of time of 2,000 years ago, just as now we're basically in a cosmic transitionary period, and we're sitting here. That's why we're in this room, is because we're reformulating ancient knowledge and trying to come up with a new format for it that's going to be more suitable for the age that we're embarking upon. So what I'm getting at here is that we've got multiple levels or multiple dimensions of meaning. On the one hand, we have the idea of the recurring theme of blood, which gets us to this idea of the royal blood and what would be the significance of a bloodline and why Christ's blood was significant. And we kind of touched on that here, but I think it gets down to the fact that there is actually something specific about the blood of Christ that has to do with the evolution of the human race, perhaps. The idea of royal blood goes back to the idea of royalty and kingship and the queen and the descent of royalty, which goes way much older than Christianity. It certainly goes back to Egypt. The idea that the pharaoh was the transmitter of this royal bloodline. That's an idea that's very universal in the ancient world, the idea of inheritance in the bloodline. Well, perhaps, and I don't know if Zechariah Sitchin has said anything about this. Maybe he has, I don't remember. But the idea that, and I know Lawrence Gardner certainly develops this idea that it goes back perhaps to ancient Egypt and ancient Samaria, and there was something, in fact, that actually caused a transformation of the human blood, and that this blood with a unique quality could be passed on through inheritance. And that's certainly one of the ideas that emerges from the study of the Grail literature. Another idea is that there's a cosmic connection, and that becomes very clear too. When we start talking about I think what we'll do here is we'll just look at some of the actual extractions from the Grail literature itself so you can get the flavor of it. This is from the Anonymous History of the Grail, 12th century. He says, "Here is the book of thy descent." Now that's important. Here's the book of thy descent. He's talking about the descent of the Grail. Here is the book of the Sangreal. Here begin the terrors. Here begin the miracles. This is how he this is how he opens his work. And he did not put his name to this work. He may have been a Templar. It's not known who this anonymous person was. But the descent. Here's the book of thy descent. He's talking about the descent of the grave. That's an important idea to be thinking about in connection with the grave. Yes.
The templates are part of the mason, like the branch of the mason.
They were possibly the evolutionary forerunners of the Masons.
Hold on it.
Well, what happened was the modern Freemasonic movement arose in parallel to the Templars, but there was a lot of cross-pollination in the 11 and 1200s. And so,
Even today, they're connected in some.
well, they're connected in the way in that when the Templars were suppressed, they probably passed, or I would say did pass, or graft into the Masonic system a core of their teachings. So they ceased to exist, more or less, but the Masons went on. So as they were ceasing to exist, they grafted into the Masonic system a lot of their teachings, a lot of their symbols. And so there's a lot of connection there. But I don't.
But now there's still a movement again where the Templars were multiplying, but there's still a remnant.
Yeah, I mean, when you go into the York Rite of Freemasonry, you find lots of information about the Templars. And I know there are some modern Templar movements. I don't know if they trace back historically to the Templars of the Middle Ages or not.
But you go and get involved in a lot of your tarot decks.
Mm-hmm.
If you study that in the 13th, 14th centuries, right along in there, when the church was raising so much hell with the Masons, there's when your tarot decks started to appear. Because if you take a good deck of tarot cards, you can lay the whole Masonic layout right out on the table.
I'm well aware of it. Yep.
I've done that, so,
Yeah.
and I know that can be done. So, but you take from Jacques de Molay and take a look at what happened in that period,
Mm-hmm.
they had to pass that information on.
In the 12th and 13th century, this was a really interesting time because you had so many things happening. I mean, you had the rise of Freemasonry, you had the rise of Templarism, you had the emergence of Catharism, you had the emergence of the Grail literature, you had the building of the great Gothic cathedrals, you had the appearance of the troubadours. The list could go on. There was so much concentrated in that roughly 150-year period that it's quite amazing. If you're interested in studying history, that's a really interesting time of history to study because there were things that were seeds that were planted 800 to 1,000 years ago that are really just now beginning to bear fruit.
Well, Martin Luther posting the things on the 92 things on the door of the church. Was it 1292 or?
Yeah. And in the Tarot, like you just mentioned, a lot of these things trace back to that same
The
period
emergence
of
of Christianity
ferment.
come up right along in there too.
Yes. Okay. Parlez-vous, also written by an anonymous author, said, "Hear ye the history of the most holy vessel that is called the Grail, in which the precious blood of Jesus was received on the day that he was put on the cross." This is early 13th century, so this is towards the end of the Grail period. Initially, there's no reference. Some of the first Grail accounts, there's no real reference to it being the cup associated with the Last Supper. Notice, though, his reference to vessel. Now, this would fit in, I think, with what Paul was saying, in that the idea that if there was a bloodline, a progeny passed on from Jesus, that it had to be through a certain vessel. And clearly, the most likely candidate for that would be Mary Magdalene. And I don't know if any of you guys ever read the Jesus Papers by Michael Begent. He pretty much lays out a pretty strong argument in there that, that I haven't seen addressed by defenders of the status quo, that, Mary Magdalene could very well have been the mother of children. He points out that Jesus was a rabbi, and that rabbis were actually required to get married. There's a lot of that stuff that I wasn't intending to get into tonight, so I didn't bring those references with me. But I think clearly there is a link between the Grail literature and this idea of the bloodline. I think that's well established and also very credible. John.
if there is this bloodline that's come down, then the question is, so what? What's been the benefit or the use of that bloodline? I mean,
DNA.
Well, and see, that's the whole, what Don just said, I mean, that would be the question. And I think if I'm reading the Grail literature and even some of the commentaries and so forth, what it would appear to me is that it has something to do with going back to antediluvian times, going back to the time when the human organism perhaps functioned different than it does now. I mean, we've made reference in here to many of the traditions from around the world of the antediluvian humanity who lived an order of magnitude longer than modern humanity. You know, that's not just biblical. That comes from all over. The idea that there have been human beings on this planet that have been extremely long lived. And of course, the central secret of alchemy is the Philosopher's Stone, the universal medicine that, you know, has the ability to cure virtually any disease. And likewise, that is described for the Grail as well. Well, it could be that there is some quality, some energetic quality to the human blood that is what's actually behind this mystery of the royal blood. And what it could be is that, and this is purely speculative, is that the Christian mysteries dealt a lot with the blood, and it may have been an attempt to preserve Egyptian traditions. In fact, that's what Lawrence Gardner more or less says, is that a lot of that idea of the royal blood came from Egypt and from Sumeria, and this was an attempt to preserve that knowledge, that there is some quality, some factor within the human blood that can be influenced through some technological means. And once that's accomplished, it has the ability to affect the literal transformation of the human being through the blood. And that seems to be implicit within the alchemical principle too, that the Philosopher's Stone somehow acts upon the blood.
well, that bloodline, as it goes through the years, it comes down, gets thinned out, and
Exactly.
thinned out.
So it doesn't mean anything anymore. I agree with that. I don't think at this point, 2,000 years later, it means anything. Jared.
Lawrence Gardner does say it means something. It's not only the DNA, but the bloodline is one for the proper guidance and rulership of mankind. And each time that bloodline is not allowed to have its leadership and do its thing, then everything goes south.
Mhm.
And in that sense, it does mean something very much. And he brings out the various periods in history where those leaders were in charge and things went very well. And vastly humanity was being raised up and all that. And then later they were suppressed and everybody was.
Well, I think what it is, the importance of it now, Don, is not so much that, there is this presence of the royal blood, but if we understand the technology behind it, that maybe what alchemy, for example, is the secret of how to resurrect that technology. And I say technology, I don't necessarily mean machinery like we think of it, but as a procedure whereby some qualitative change can be effected in the human via the blood. And both the Grail literature and the alchemical literature seem to concur on this point. So
Here, there's a vessel that is called Ray. People there, there's the history, let me change that to the story and the history of the state. And that's kind of Holy Grail, the story of the history. Mankind is different to the higher state of consciousness. And from that, how it no.
And I think that perhaps the natural consequences of affecting this clicking would be an advancement of the human species. And alchemy and the Grail probably represent a key a key element of understanding in how that process works and how we can, reactivate that process. I think that the evidence suggests that there's been a body of initiates that have existed throughout the ages whose primary purpose is to preserve certain kinds of esoteric knowledge that deals directly with the transformation of human beings into something beyond what we are now, or perhaps even a return to something that we once were, that we have degenerated or descended from. And certainly a lot of the traditions, see, and here we get into the notion of the gods. We cannot talk about alchemy and the meaning of the Philosopher's Stone. We cannot talk about the Grail without eventually coming upon and having to reckon up with this whole concept of the gods, whatever that was, that ancient peoples all over the world believed in, including early Christians, including the authors of the Bible, that there was a pantheon of, however you want to describe it, whether it's forces or actually beings or whatever, they all, again, have these same kind of parallels. That's why it's so easy to take the parallels between Roman gods and Greek gods. Well, the word in the original Hebrew of the Bible, the word used for God is Elohim, which is spelled with 5 Hebrew letters. Now, this is a little shot of Kabbalah here. Aleph, Lamed, He, Yud, Mem. Elohim. And it ends in the letters Yod, Mem. Well, whenever you have Yod, Mem at the end of a Hebrew word in biblical Hebrew, it renders it plural, just like putting an S on the end of an English word renders it plural. And so the first verse should read more correctly, in the beginning, the gods created the heaven and the earth, rather than God with the connotation of singular. The connotation of God as a singular doesn't even come until the 3rd chapter with the introduction of Jehovah or Yahweh. Prior to that, you have every reference to God being Elohim, which is this plural word over and over again, plural, using this plural term for God, which is more correctly, because it ends in Yod Mem, it should be rendered into English with an S at the end to make it a plural. And then you have the appearance of Yahweh, who in the English Bible, whenever you read the word Lord, that's Yahweh. Whenever you read the word God, that's Elohim or Elohim. So this idea of plurality of gods is actually there in the Bible as well. And then, of course, when you begin reading the verses, then you take that into account. When it says, let us go down and there confound their tongue, let us go down. There are frequently, now man has become as one of us. So lest he reach out his hand and eat of the tree of life and live forever, let us go down and bar the gates to the guard so that he can't return. Because in the story, man was beguiled by the serpent, ate of the fruit of tree of knowledge. His eyes were opened, as the serpent proclaimed would happen. And then, upon seeing that, the Elohim or the gods say, and it comes through into King James English, let us go down. Let us, and they use the plural. Who's talking to whom there? See, there's another layer to this whole thing that's being completely missed here.
Well, there's also when you read, take the stories and take the God part and the Lord part, if you read them separately, it sounds like they're talking about 2 different kind of people.
Yes. What Paul just said is also critical, is it almost seems like there's 2 different accounts that have been interwoven. And actually, there have been scholars who have attempted to separate the 2, and they call it the Elohimic account and the Yahwistic account. And that's probably true. Yeah, in fact, there's actually 2 separate, very distinct accounts of the creation of man. The creation of man in the image of the God is Elohimic. The creation of man from clay or the dust of the ground is Yahwistic. And there's 2, in the 2 accounts, there's completely different orders of things that are given. And I have not yet seen mainstream Christians really even attempt to reconcile that at all. Anyways, let's go on. My point is that this idea of the gods is maybe what we're ultimately going to get back to, is once we have a handle on what we're talking about, what ancient people really meant when they were talking about the gods, and then the idea, just like with the the Nephilim interbreeding with man. I mean, we read that right there in the Bible. It talks about prior to the flood, what happens. There were giants in the earth in those days, and they came in unto the daughters of men and bear these heroic individuals who are apparently hybrids between humans and the gods, whatever the gods are. So perhaps, and this is of course purely speculative, once we get a notion of what we mean by the gods, and again, just like the Bible makes a reference, the Greeks are full of these half-breeds between humans and gods. And when we read the origin of the Pharaoh in Egypt was descended from the gods. And what set him apart was his royal blood. And his royal blood was the signature of the fact that he was descended from gods. So who were the gods? That's the question that it brings us to. Who and what were these gods? Let's go on with the Grail.
With decision.
With racist decision. Well, before we get to Sitchin, let's look at the definition of the Grail itself, because there is Kabbalists know, before we read that, Kabbalists know that the language we use itself has hidden dimensions of meaning. The Kabbalists, because you wanted to talk about Kabbalah, the Kabbalists know that to get to the esoteric meanings of words, you have to do several things. You have to trace its etymology back to its original meanings. And then as you trace the path back to its original meaning, you'll see that there are divergent pathways, divergent roads that are coming in. And so you go back to the original meaning, then you turn around, and as you go back towards the modern meaning, you take these divergent pathways. So because the original meaning may compress within itself half a dozen different meanings that all have to be taken into account to get the totality of its original meaning. But as it evolves, it splits. So you get a word bifurcating or trifurcating and creating different etymologies. So you follow these different etymological lines until you can get a complete picture of where the word came from. And some of the meanings, whenever it splits, so it's just like a river flowing along that might split into two pathways. Each pathway is missing some of the water that was in the original river channel. So when the meaning of a word splits, you may be missing part of the original meaning here, but if you jump over to one of these parallel pathways, there you will find the meaning contained. Let's look at the word grail and see where it comes from. It's a noun. It means a cup. It's also taken as a chalice, which according to medieval legend was used by Jesus at the Last Supper, and in which Joseph of Arimathea received the last drops of Jesus' blood at the cross. Now notice this is from the 1967 edition. This next phrase, the next definition, used often as a symbol for a lost, pure kind of Christianity. I've noticed in modern dictionaries that part of it has now been removed. Yeah, I haven't found a modern dictionary that has that in it, but the old dictionaries have. Used often as a symbol for a lost, pure kind of Christianity. So the implication there is clear. I mean, there was a tradition of a lost Christianity. Now, let's follow its etymology. It goes back to the Middle English, and it's grail, spelled with a Y. It's taken from the Old French, meaning a modification. M means modification of graal with a double L, taken from the Middle Latin, which means a modification of the stem of gradale, which means a plate, or its derivation from the Latin crater, which means bowl, taken from the Greek, meaning crater. So now, if we follow the etymology of that word, we see an interesting split somewhere along the line. In English now, we have the word grail, and we use it. It's very specific in reference to this thing right here in the Grail literature. But one of these parallel evolutions, etymological evolutions, has led to another modern English word, which we use, which is crater.
I knew that comment would get in there somewhere.
You had to know that. Of course, you had to know that because the Grail is a cosmic science. And just like you couldn't take you couldn't take the carburetor, you couldn't take the ignition out of your car and get anywhere. If you leave the comet out of the whole cosmic science, basically you're missing. It's like trying to explain reproduction without the spermatozoa. Good luck. You can't do it. So, crater, interestingly, is a bowl, isn't it? Anybody's ever seen Meteor Crater, you're standing there looking into a great bowl. You're looking into a cup. Now, what's very, very interesting is when you study the geochemistry of cratering, you discover that there's something very interesting, and we're going to get into that. Because basically what we have is the cratering process, the process by which craters, by which bowls, cups, grails are created in the landscape is a process of cosmic fertilization of terra firma. Cosmic fertilization, that's what's happening. The planet is being fertilized with various kinds of substances brought in from space. We won't talk at this point about the origin of this process, but there's certainly enough known now that critical elements are being introduced into the system via these agencies from space whose fingerprint on the planet is the crater, the bowl, the cup. When a comet comes in, or a byproduct of a comet, such as an asteroid, which could be a spent comet nucleus, it comes in, it strikes the surface of the Earth, it injects exotic substances into the crust of the Earth. It's in a sense, it's almost like a cosmic homeopathic operation on the Earth itself by it receiving these influxes of material and energetic substances. So here we go. Here's the two principal meanings that we discover when we just look at the simple definition of grape. The cup or chalice used at the Last Supper, in which Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood of Jesus during the crucifixion, and also a symbol for a lost pure kind of Christianity. Now, who is Joseph of Arimathea? In the literature, we discovered that Joseph of Arimathea is described as being one of the secret disciples of Christ. And to me, that is one of the most important phrases in the whole of the New Testament. Because what it does, it's one of those little words, by just putting that one word in there, it's like a crack within the Orthodox, which suggests that there's a whole lot more going on there than is recognized by Orthodox. Let's see, I bet you I have I bet you I even have that quote. How many of you ever read the accounts of the crucifixion? Oh, yes, here's the exact quote from the 19th chapter of John. And after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus, and there came also Nicodemus, which at first came to Jesus by night, in other words, came to Jesus in secret, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Then they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. Now I've got some underlined things in here because the underlined things are each important clues to the fact that what was really going on in this whole episode was behind the scenes and did not make it into the reportage of John when he set this account down in the Bible. So we have to read between the lines. And again, Joseph of Arimathea, think about this. Being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly. Now, we all think of Jesus, we're taught in Sunday school Jesus had 12 disciples, right? Well, we're never really told, wait a minute, he had secret disciples as well. Well, because that opens up a whole big can of worms when you say, well, who were these secret disciples? Was Joseph and Nicodemus the only ones? And why were the secret disciples so intimately connected with this whole crucifixion process? And now, how is it that there just happened to be a new sepulcher that had never been used before, and it happened to be right there next to the garden in which Jesus is crucified? So when you begin to look at the Bible itself, there are things that just seem to cry out for deeper investigation. Let's go back to the Grail. Here where we were at. Okay, so talking about parallelism, here we see the Tarot card, the Ace of Cups, which is totally Grail symbolism. And what we see here is very interesting because there's a great secret right in front of your faces right now. Of that, I'm convinced. What do we see here? We see the Grail. We see a hand coming out of a cloud holding this cup.
The dove
Right.
representing Holy Spirit.
We see the dove descending. Here's this idea of descent again.
But what's he got in his mouth?
Got a wafer. He's got a wafer with a cross on it.
Yep.
And he's bringing that wafer and about to deposit that wafer into the cup. You also notice that there's streams of water coming out of the cup.
But there's 5, so that's what's that's involved. It's 5 strings.
5 streams of water, yes. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is 5 as being the number of humanity, mankind. But we do, like, what's your name? Linda. Like Linda just noticed, there are 5 streams of water coming out, flowing into this pond down there. There are also drops descending as well as the streams. And they're coming out of the cup. So something is happening. Some process is being indicated here that involves this introduction of this disc, this pantacle, whatever this is, into the cup.
Symbol for earth.
Symbol for earth, because of the fourfold.
So
It's not quite the symbol for the earth, though, because the cross doesn't reach all the way to the circumference of the circle.
Spark of God at the soul.
What is the W represent?
I think the nail.
Yes, we actually got into that.
Is that an M?
Well, it could be a W or an M, because many times in the symbolism, it would be upside down. If it's upside down, it's an M. If it's an M, what could that stand for? It very well could stand for Mary. It could also stand for, Magdalene. Which, if that's what it does stand for, it's pretty suggestive to have an M on it. With the esoteric symbolism, there are multiple meanings. Like he just said, the body. Yes, it probably represents the body. In fact, I think it represents the body, perhaps, of the Magdalene. But it also represents the alembicum vitrum. It represents the athanor in which the alchemical transmutation takes place after the introduction of extraterrestrial substances. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing right here. I think that wafer represents matter being introduced from above. The descent of something, the dove is the instrument by which this matter is conveyed and deposited into this cup. And then out of the cup flows the streams of water that are now fertilizing the pond. So there's a lot of meaning in this card, and this is how you penetrate the mysteries, is through the contemplation of the symbols.
There's another picture on there that you have on the neck. There, it looks like a little bug or something
A little bug.
under the
Yeah.
arm.
Or is that the design?
I think that's a little floral, a little flourish, a little design.
Where did we-
Or it looks like a person or something.
Are you talking about that little thing right
Yeah.
there?
If you look at to the hand, the cloud, not the cloud, but to the majestic hand,
Uh-huh,
with all the kings,
right.
they wear clothes, they have lots of.
Roughly. Well, now, in esoteric symbolism, there are meanings to the hand, right? In Kabbalah, since we're now going to be talking about Kabbalah, the Yud, which is considered to be the seed of the Hebrew alphabet, also means hand. It means hand. Just like Gimel, the third letter, means candle, or Dalet, the fourth letter, means door, or Bet, the second letter, means house, or Aleph, the first letter, means ox. Ayin means eye. The word ayin means eye in ancient Hebrew, but it also means spring, as it does in Arabic as well. And here's another depiction of the Grail, and this is in the church at Randall Chateau. And what you see here is the Grail cup, and you see this disc or circle again with a cross on it. Now, the question is this disc rising up from the cup, or is it descending into the cup? Or can it represent both processes of descent and ascent, depending on where you are in the process? This is at Rennes Chateau, one of the great centers of the mystery. The legend of the Grail is the Celtic version with particular application to Brit of a universal theme concerning something which has vanished and must be found or invoked again for the redemption of life on earth. John Michel and Christine Rohn wrote that in the 12 Tribe Nations and the Science of Enchanting the Landscape. How many of you read John Michel? Maybe the work of John Michel? Really one of the true modern visionaries. He's made great studies in depth of the Grail literature, the story of Joseph of Arimathea. He's done a lot of studies into the megalithic science. He's done a lot of studies into Kabbalah. He's combined these studies, synthesized these studies into his books, View Over Atlantis, City of Revelation, the 12 Tribe Nations, City of Revelation, said that, Dimensions of Paradise.
Well, I've read it. I had the over Atlantis.
View Over Atlantis, that was his second book. I think it came out in 1969. A universal theme concerning something which has vanished and must be found or invoked again for the redemption of life on earth. So what could that possibly be?
Don't
It's
switch
now
it.
it's happening. It's very long.
At this very moment, even as we speak. The science of enchanting the landscape. You know where the word enchant comes from, right?
Chanting.
Chanting, yes, chanting. So what do you do when you chant? Yeah, you're sending out vibrations, sound vibrations into the ethers. Can I go on, Jerry?
Well, I have a question about what did they, is there something useful in this enchanting landscape? What are they doing?
Well, he talks a lot about the perpetual choirs back in the Middle Ages that would go on for hundreds of years even. And the relationship between the perpetual choirs and the fertility of the landscape and so forth. No legend of the Middle Ages, except those endorsed by the church, has had so strong an evocative and provocative power as the strange fictions which grew up about the Grail. Thanks to Tennyson and Wagner, Galahad and Parsifal have become types of chastity the quest of the mysterious vessel has come to mean, on the one hand, a vain following after wandering fires, or on the other, the arduous search for supreme mystical experience. Now, the interesting thing is those two apparently polar opposite meanings are not actually contradictory. Because what is the reference throughout the Grail literature to wandering fires?
Wait a minute, wait. Is there, in this Grail and alchemy thing, is there any reference to a Kundalini?
Well, I think the fact that you've got serpents and dragons all throughout, yes, I can say that the answer is definitely yes.
In the mystical experience, could have a wandering fire that wanders to the right place. Kundalini.
Sure. I think we're talking here again, we're talking about a multi-dimensional science here. We're talking about a science that is not only a science, an inner science of self-transformation, it's an outer science of world transformation.
What I'm getting at is there support for using the Kundalini and these references, or do they say do it some other way?
I don't know. You'll have to read it yourself and see what you think. I won't claim to be an expert in Tantrism, so I can't make the parallels between the Tantric literature and this. But I would say that from what I know of the yogic practices and so on, and practices of prana and so forth, and activation of the Kundalini, I would say that there's probably a great deal of this that has to do with it. It is not strange that the medieval legends should have engendered in our century so diverse an offspring, for they form a bewildering assortment of battle and banquet, earthy magic, and sacramental miracle, blood feuds, and mysterious rites. Bewilderment begets curiosity and seeks a solution. And over the last 100 years, scholars and would-be scholars have tried to discover the secrets of the Grail, with such contrasting results that the reading public, eager for enlightenment, may well feel more puzzled than ever. The quest of the Grail has led to the Punjab in India, to the palace of Atreus in Mycenae, the temple of Zeus at Dodona. I'm going to jump down, pick up a book on the subject, and you may be told with a great show of erudition that the object itself was derived from the cauldron of the Irish god Dagda, from the eye of the Egyptian god Thoth, from a symbol of the female organ of generation, from a pearl of the Zoroastrian cult named Gohar, from a talisman of the heretical Albigensians, who were the Cathars, once adored in a cavern of the Pyrenees, or from a great sapphire formerly preserved in the sacristy of Glastonbury Abbey. On the other hand, there are those scholars who are content to believe that the Grail was ab origine, conceived as a peculiarly holy Eucharistic vessel, meaning ab origine, meaning originally. Now, pause for a minute and let's look at some of those meanings that scholars who have delved into the Grail literature have pulled out of there. And when you take the standpoint of conventional scholarship, and you see that all of these scholars looking into it are seeing different things, well, then you assume, well, then obviously the whole notion of this Holy Grail is too convoluted to ever possibly make rational sense of. On the other hand, most of these interpretations are probably valid. There is a connection between the Grail and the Eye of Thoth. There is a connection between the Grail and the cauldron of the Irish god Dagda. There is a connection between the Grail and the heretical talisman of the Albigensians. There is a connection between the Grail and the idea of a great sapphire. Recall the Hindu story about the five blind men? How did it go again? And each one was feeling a different part of the elephant. We've all heard that story. Well, this is what's going on here. One of them was feeling the leg, one was the tail, one was the body, one was an ear, and one was the trunk. And then when they were asked to describe what they were feeling, everyone described something completely different. But if you could stand back and see it with open eyes, you would see that they were all describing different parts of the same animal. Well, that's what's going on here. And you have to take these different parts and try to put them back together to see the whole animal that it's talking about. Now, not all of these speculations are as fatuous and incredible as they seem, and some find their excuse, if not their justification, in the diversity and the contradictions of the medieval texts themselves. For in them, too, there is a strange disagreement. The Grail may be described as the dish from which Christ ate the Passover lamb at the Last Supper, or as the chalice of the first sacrament, in which later the Savior's blood was caught as it flowed from his wounded body, or as a stone with miraculous feeding and youth-preserving virtues, or as a salver containing a man's head swimming in blood. Now that's a rather gruesome image, a man's head, a salver, a plate with a man's head swimming in blood. But again, this is esoteric. So each one of these things, see, the Grail literature itself is filled with these contradictions that, well, which one is right? Is this guy right? Is this guy right? Is this guy right? No, they're all right in the sense that they're all describing different parts of the same animal.
So a salve means plate.
Yeah, like a serving. I think it's like a serving tray.
So is the salve and crater then are related?
Maybe.
Like salvation and grail then?
Yeah. Just do some homework. Do the etymological origins of the word salve. It may be borne through a castle hall by a beautiful damsel, or it may float through the air in Arthur's palace, veiled in white samite, or it may be, which is a type of cloth used to make long white robes out of, or it may be placed on a table in the east, together with a freshly caught fish, and serve as a talisman to distinguish the chaste from the unchaste. Its custodian may be called Braun, or Amfortas, or Pallas, or Joseph of Arimathea, or simply the Fisher King. He may be sound of wind and limb, or pierced through the thighs, or wounded in the genitals. The hero who achieves the quest may be the notoriously amorous Gawain, or the Virgin Galahad. Again, the Grail literature is not meant to be penetrated without some effort, some study, without some meditation, without some research. But when you begin to look at all of these things and begin to ponder, you begin to get the glimmer of a series of webs or connections, interconnections between these things. Notice a freshly caught fish, and the reference to the guardian of the Grail is the Fisher King. What does this suggest when you start talking about fish?
Nice.
Yes, exactly. Pisces, the Piscean age.
It's also the Nazareans that pulls up the sect that Jesus was with.
Used a fish as an emblem.
Yeah, their whole life was water symbology at one right moment.
Yes, and Pisces began rising with the equinoctial sun 2,000 years ago at the birth of Christianity. And very clearly, just like all of the other esoteric traditions, Christianity had a strong astronomical context in which it was to be understood. So if you choose to get into this stuff, you have to basically be willing to entertain all of these mutually inconsistent images in your head until at some point they'll begin to fuse. So what would it mean that, it floats through the air in Arthur's palace, veiled in white samite? So you've got to get a picture of this. The picture of a damsel wearing a long white gown, bearing the Grail through this great hall in which various characters, whether it's Galahad or Parsifal or Gawain, is seated at this great feast, and this procession comes through in some of the descriptions, and there is this beautiful damsel carrying a tray, and on this tray is the Grail, and it's so luminous it's difficult to look at. Another Grail scholar, modern Grail scholar, commenting, there was a strong Celtic influence in the legends of the Grail, particularly about an other world to which the dying heroes went. Arthur to Avalon, Bran to the blessed Isles of the West, rather than to Montsalvash or the Mount of Salvation, on which the Grail castle was built. All of the marvels of that castle of the Fisher King were further to be found in the castle of the divine Lugh, which had held the treasures of the Celtic gods, including a bleeding lance. Pause there for a minute. Now, where do we get the picture? How does a bleeding lance find its way into the Christian mythos?
The sword of, yeah.
Sure.
Sword of destiny.
Sure, exactly. See, now this was another thing that was grafted on from much earlier traditions, the spear of Longinus, the spear that was used to pierce the left side of Christ to determine whether or not he was actually dead. And then, of course, there's a whole history about what happened with that lance or that spear down through the ages and so forth that may or may not be credible, but there certainly does seem to be some history behind it. So this idea of the bleeding lance. Now, again, you picture that this, remember what happened, we just read, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus go to Pilate, and they ask for the body of Christ, and Pilate's response is, well, wait a second. We Romans are experts at crucifixion, and we've got the whole process designed to prolong the death process for days and days at a time. And now you're telling me that Jesus is already dead after only 6 hours? Come on, I don't believe that he's dead. So he turns to the centurion and he goes, go out there and see if he's really dead. So Longinus goes out there with his lance and prods him in the side and sees no response and comes back and says, yeah, he's dead. So Pontius Pilate then says, okay, you guys can have the body. Takes the body and off they secreted it off to this newly hewn sepulcher carved out of the rock right next to the garden where he happened to be crucified. We find in other details, in fact, that the garden is on private land, which is interesting. And you know who owns the private land? Joseph of Arimathea. So clearly there's more going on here than meets the eye. So let's go on here. So we've got the bleeding lance. This was also possessed by the Welsh Grail Knight Peredur, a bottomless drinking vessel, a cauldron that could feed an army, an unconquerable sword, and finally, and I find this to be a very significant clue, a stone fallen from heaven, as in Parzival, a stone of destiny or scone on which the Irish and Scots kings were crowned until the English took it away for their coronations of the kings of Great Britain in Westminster. After 700 years, its formal return to Scotland was finally granted. Now, it's significant that the stone used to confer kingship upon the early Scottish kings was, at least according to legend, and I don't know if it's been scientifically proven, but I think it has been confirmed that it is in fact a meteorite, a stone fallen from heaven.
It was also supposed to have been the Jacob's pillow.
As in the ladder to heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now a lot of people would prefer that these kind of mysteries didn't require any effort and a lot of thought. They'd rather have somebody just stand up there and spell it out and say, here it is, A, B, and C, and this is what it means. That's not how this works. That's not how this process works. This is a process where you basically have to integrate these symbols and these stories into your consciousness. They have to become a part of literally your conscious view of the world. You have to become one with these symbols. And it is only then that you begin to extract the meaning. And somebody like me looks for somebody who can guide me, and I in turn try to guide others, and I don't claim to have the final word on all of this. What I do claim to have done, though, is made several of the preliminary connections without which further progress is going to be impossible. And so my purpose here is to try to share or convey those connections because this is a big job. And as we now reach the end of the Piscean age and the cosmic hourglass is slowly running out on us, we've got a lot of work to do. Okay, so again, get this imagery in your mind. And part of the occult training that goes on is being able to hold multiple images and symbols in your mind simultaneously. So quickly, a summary of the Grail literature. Most of these were in the 11 and 1200s. We won't necessarily have to go through all of these unless some of you want to become serious Grail scholars and want the sources. I can give them to you. I haven't read all of these by any means. I've read parts of probably 3/4 of them, and I've read all of maybe 3 or 4 of them. But this lists the 10 principal works that are essentially the sources of the Grail knowledge. Most of them were, in fact, all of the ones listed here were all 11th and 12th centuries. Besides the romances listed in this list of 10 here, there are numerous medieval translations of French texts into other languages: Norse, Irish, Welsh, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, and Dutch. The total bulk of the Grail romances produced before the Renaissance was prodigious. It is noteworthy, however, that all of the basic texts listed above were composed within a period of about 50 years. The earliest, Chrétien's poem, was written about 1180. So within about 50 years. And it was this 50-year period that saw the emergence of the Gothic,
Cathedral.
the appearance, the rise of the Knights Templar to preeminence, the emergence of the Albigensians or the Cathars, the emergence of the Troubadours, the emergence of the Tarot, again, on and on and on. And also, it represents, at this same 50-year period, was the final culminating effort in the great mound building in North America and the great works down in southwestern U.S. So while this incredible 50-year period of ferment was transpiring over in Europe, over here in North America, there was also this period of tremendous ferment, with the last great effort of architectural, sacred architecture in North America occurred precisely during the same 50 years.
So they could be.
I find that to be a significant connection.
So it's possible, and that even raises the possibility that some of these legends were like the software. That was the structure.
See, I like that analogy.
Yeah, to operate the
Right.
great construction.
We've said that before in here, and I think that's a really good analogy. When we look at the sacred architecture, the structures that we saw in the southwestern desert, when we look at the great earthworks, when we look at the Gothic cathedrals, what we're seeing is the hardware. What the software, the literature that we're seeing is the instruction manual, and the rituals that were performed within the sacred structures was the software. So basically that's it. You've got the hardware, which is the infrastructure itself. You've got the ritual. The actions that went on within there is the software, and the literature is the set of specifications, the instruction manual that tells you how to reassemble the machine and activate it. And above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne, is the appearance of a sapphire stone. We found that a sapphire stone is one of the designations of the Grail, a green sapphire stone. Now let's read some extracts from the actual Grail literature itself. Here's Wolfram von Eschenbach's, which I think is my favorite. It is well known to me that many brave knights dwell with the Grail at Mont Sauvage. Always when they ride out, as they often do, it is to seek adventure. They do so for their sins, these Templars, whether their reward be by defeat or victory. A valiant host lives there, and I will tell you how they are sustained. They live from a stone of the purest essence. It is called lapis exilis. By the power of this stone, the phoenix is burned to ashes, but from the ashes she is reborn. Thus does the phoenix molt and change her plumage which afterwards is as bright and shining and as lovely as before. This stone confers such powers on mortal men so that their flesh and bones are made young again. The stone is called the Grail, and it is unknown save to those who are singled out by name to join the company of the Mont Sauvage. The stone confers such powers on mortal men so that their flesh and bones are made young again. That's exactly how the philosopher's stone in alchemy is described.
Lapis exilis.
Lapis exilis. Now that's a very interesting term. And the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail have examined the origin of that term and several of its parallel meanings. And here's what they say about it. According to Wolfram, then, the Grail is a stone of some kind. But such a definition of the Grail is far more provocative than satisfying. Scholars have suggested a number of interpretations of the phrase lapis exilis, all of which is established alchemical short for resurrection or rebirth, and also in medieval iconography is an emblem of the dying and resurrected Jesus. Now, this is loaded. I mean, this is loaded with stuff. I mean, the term used by Wolfram to describe the Grail literally is telling us what it is: a stone fallen from heaven. The original meaning of the word connects the most predominant earthly or terrestrial consequence of this stone falling from heaven, the Grail, the geomorphic cup that forms when the stone falls from heaven and interacts with the earth. Also, we see the term lapis elixir used by the alchemist to describe the philosopher's stone, the very thing which has the power, the universal medicine, the thing which can transform the human organism. Don. Good, that's what we want.
Okay, are you familiar with the blue pearl?
Of the Hopis
No, the yoga tradition.
in
In yoga, you get really deep into this stuff. And I did one of their courses at the City Yoga. And you go so far inward, you come to the center of your being, and you will see the blue pearl. And when I saw it, now the blue pearl, you know, the old sign, that little wiggle comes off, it's a little dot, that's the blue pearl.
the dot.
The dot is, and it's in a cup, it's in a chalice. All right, when I saw it, I was in the blackest of black. It told me that it would be so black that I'd never seen this black before. And it was black. I got through the black, and I saw these pair of hands come out like this. I saw this blue come up. And when I approached them, in this black and black, and I saw those hands and this blue thing, or this pearl come up, I was in the presence of total love and compassion. I collapsed. It was totally overpowering. It just consumed. I was in the presence of God. And I saw that blue pearl, and that was the essence of what we were trying to do. But there may be some connection there. Got your blue stone, your blue pearl, and it's the center of your being, and it's God.
Yeah, and Jesus makes reference to the pearl of great price. This extremely valuable pearl. Makes several references to that in the New Testament literature. I think you're right. I absolutely think you're right. See, what you were doing was practicing an internal technology that led you to that experience, right? Could you describe it as that, the whole process?
Oh,
yes. Well,
they took me through the different astral bodies,
mhm.
and the last one before you got to the blue was the blackest of black.
And see, in alchemy, they describe that there's a sequence of colors that the alchemist goes through.
Right.
And at the end of the process is the blackest of the black.
Oh my God.
It's right there in alchemy, and I can put you right onto that. It's
Actually, they mentioned about that writing is Zoroastrian and the Gohan.
pardon me.
You know, you read it. Zoroastrian.
Zoroastrian, yeah.
Yes. Well, how? War means a jewel.
The jewel.
The jewel, if you saw the jewel, after the blackness from the jewel, the pass from the astral consciousness to the outer consciousness, the black.
Yeah, and then you had this like chalice, but I saw a hand that formed this chalice, and it came up out of there. And that was the blue pearl.
Yeah.
And I was totally consumed. They had to dig me up like once.
When was this?
Well, I'd say this is about 8 or 9 years ago that I said, oh,
Yeah, I had one of those collapse experiences, very similar to what you just described when I was practicing, my third year of practice. Pretty much, you get to a point where, there's a disconnect between your consciousness and your body.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah,
Is it sometimes called the stone of light?
I have never heard that one, but maybe
What? Stone of light.
stone of light,
Yeah.
maybe. Where'd you come up with that one?
I thought I'd seen it somewhere, and I just ran across, looking up minerals like zeolite, and the word light is often used as a suffix,
Mm-hmm.
and it comes from the word lith.
Lithic, stone and light, interesting,
Yeah, so,
because lithic means stone,
right. So when
Paleolithic, megalithic.
yeah, so they name all these minerals, yada yada light. The light part is lithic, so light and stone seem to have,
A common etymology.
yeah, maybe.
Well, why don't you do some research, Jeremy, and get back to me. If the phoenix is indeed somehow representative of Jesus, Wolfram is implicitly associating him with a stone. Such an association is, of course, hardly unique. There is Peter or Pierre, which means stone in French, the stone or rock on which Jesus establishes his church. And as we discovered, Jesus in the New Testament explicitly equates himself with the keystone neglected by the builders, the keystone of the temple, the rock of Scion. And that, here are two of those verses. We find in the Old Testament Psalms, the stones which the builders refused is become the headstone of the corner. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And then we come to the New Testament, 12th chapter of Mark. And have ye not read this scripture? The stone which the builders rejected is become the head of the corner. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. What are they talking about? The stone which the builders rejected. Ponder that. Ponder it deeply. So if the phoenix is indeed somehow representative of Jesus, Wolfram is implicitly associating him with a stone. As we discovered, Jesus in the New Testament explicitly equates himself with the keystone neglected by the builders, the keystone of the temple. And then Jeremy made a reference earlier to Jacob's pillow. And we see that Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows, and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set upon the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. Notice that they were ascending and descending. And Jacob awaked out of his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid, and said, how dreadful is this place? This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob rose up early in the morning, and took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and he set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on the top of it.
Sounds like he slept on a portal.
Yeah, and the connection with the stone, placing his head upon the stone and having this dream. And then what he does is curious. He sets it up as a pillar and pours oil on it.
Sure not wanting Sasquatch going up and down that ladder
I'm not sure about that, Bill.
to. It was only on the right day of the month that the Sasquatch used.
Why would he pour oil on it? Well, you know, the at the coronation of the pharaohs, they poured oil on the pharaoh's head. And if you remember at the account of the evening before the crucifixion, when Jesus was had his feet bathed, you remember, probably by Mary Magdalene, what did she do at the end? She poured oil on his head. Expensive oil. Yes, Don.
There's an interesting twist of singulars and plurals. Up at the first paragraph of the fourth line, it said, and he put them for his pillows. He took stones,
Yeah.
right? So plural stones, and made for his pillow. But at the bottom it says, and took the stone that he had made, that he had put for his pillows, and set it
Before I
for. So,
comment on that, I would double check, make sure I didn't get some typos in there.
okay, because there's an S missing for that stone. If that's
Of course, you know, that old English is sometimes like that. But the first thing that comes to my mind is the menhir.
Yep.
You know, what is a menhir? It's a solitary stone pillar that was set into the ground.
As well as Ben stones.
Ben stones in
Yep.
Egypt, which are also boundary stones. But they're all over the British Isles, and in fact, they're set up they're in North America as well.
The jet stones.
Yes. Well, here we have a Masonic carpet depicting elements of what we've just read about. And this elaborates upon the whole account of Jacob. And this is not only Masonic, but it's very alchemic. You see the presence of the sun, the moon.
The
Sun and
pillars,
the moon.
the pillars of heaven. These.
We see the three pillars. There's the ladder with the angel descending and ascending out. What else do we see on here?
The 7 stars of Pleiades.
That could be very well 7
And
stars
you've
up
got
here.
the pillars. One's
here.
Corinthian, one is Doric, one's Ionian.
Also the
What?
roll.
The checkerboard floor. Yep. And
Also there's the or
for-
people.
very good. Paul just noticed. Now notice here and here are 2 stones. That's an important symbol. We've talked about that. Here's the polished stone, and here's the rough ashlar.
Yep.
Which represents the stone when it's first removed from nature and it's in its raw state before it has been polished and carved in order to be fit into the temple. You can't take the rough stone right out of the ground and put it into the temple. It has to be processed. Now, to Masons, that has a manifold meaning, just like all of these esoteric and occult symbols. On the one hand, it's the individual aspect to the mysteries that has to be polished and tried and true before being fitted into the temple of the Savior. The second thing is it's a symbol for civilization itself, coming from the rough quarry of nature and having to be gone through this process where it can be perfected and fit into this temple, which is the one element of the holy city that Masons believe that ultimately it's their destiny to rebuild the holy city, which has fallen into ruin. And that comes straight from the Templars, this idea of the resurrection of the holy city. There's lots of symbolism in this.
Well, and that actually, what you talked about the checkerboard fort, one thing that stands out to me, they didn't know how to do that perspective drawing until what, about the 15 or so hundreds? That's an important historical note on that, because you look at some of the older paintings, their perspective was all messed up.
Mhm.
That was one good bit of development, and it took to get their laws of perspective down.
Right.
I got a question.
Yes.
There's a star that you didn't mention.
I didn't mention it, did I?
Oh, the seven
Oh, you
stars,
called me out on that, didn't you, Jerry?
the seven stars around the moon too.
Well, same.
Yeah, Sam pointed that out. Jerry was just calling attention to the seven-pointed star right here.
What is that?
The columns have different things on them, you get close to the top.
Yes, they do. Let's look at what Linda is talking about there. We have different orders of architecture.
Yeah.
And of course, today you have to understand that in the ancient Greeks, the different orders of architecture all had arcane significance. And as we look here,
I forget what the other one is.
well, this would be Doric,
Doric.
and this would be Ionic, and that would be Corinthian.
What is the,
Very good, Linda.
what is the star?
You get a gold star for that. One with 7 points.
What is the star?
What is it?
It's in between. It's in the middle.
Yeah,
God is star.
it's what?
Star. Hey, I'm asking him.
Well, let's go on and see if there's any answers awaiting us.
The reason I wanna know,
Is that a lotus or what's the flower in the corner, green corner,
The extreme corner.
on the border?
Oh, on the border?
Lotus?
I'm gonna guess it's a lily, but I don't know for sure.
what is that?
Could be a tassel, right? It probably is a tassel because there would be tassels on the cart.
The reason I wanna know about the star, is
Well, that's the reason.
the rough ashlar is under the moon,
Oh, yeah.
and the finished ashlar is under the sun.
Yeah,
So there's obviously a progression.
and then the ladder leads directly up to the star, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I wanna know what the relation is with the star. You got this little map on the floor, and
Right here? Yeah,
so the map and the star seem to be related. And a little table too, where they observe the refreshments.
Oh, yeah, the altar.
where do you see the altar?
Altar, right there, facing the stair.
Oh, this?
The
Yeah.
little table
Yeah.
right there.
Right.
Anyway, you've left out some of the stuff from the middle.
Yeah, I did.
And-
I'll admit.
I think that the star is related to the history of this third eye.
And how many points on the sun? Okay, quite count them.
Well, I don't know, Bill.
I was thinking,
Would you like a copy of this?
yeah, 32 or something like that, most likely.
I wouldn't be surprised. This is an example of Masonic carpet that is used during Masonic rituals that's brought out and then unrolled as one makes their ambulations around the lodge. It's a teaching mechanism. Michael Begent in the Jesus Papers back in 2006 said, in this story about Jacob, it is certainly possible that Bethel is in fact located among the sacred stones of some hilltop Canaanite shrine. Such shrines were traditionally built in high places. The fact that Jacob reportedly set up one of the stones afterwards and ritually anointed it further suggests that a shrine, a dwelling place of God, already existed there. Although it is downplayed in the text, it is evident that in some way Jacob clearly felt that the stone had contributed to his vision and contained some sacred magical quality. Or possible that a site of special energy already existed, and somehow by taking the stone and standing it up as a menhir and putting on an unspecified oil over it, perhaps you are somehow amplifying the energy or setting up some type of a current flow that was not normally there, but can only be derived if you have a place where the energy exists in potentiality.
Yeah, and you also use oils like that as radionic witnesses.
Sure.
You know, they use that in all the time with the cosmic pipes. They have, use them because they don't freeze.
Right.
They last for years.
Let's go on. More significantly, Jacob's dream is better understood as a vision, and one that teaches us a number of important things. Perhaps the most crucial lesson lies in the report of angels ascending and descending. This is clearly a symbolic demonstration that the link between heaven and earth is dynamic, that the divine qualities are constantly flowing to and fro, This is expresses the idea we've already seen in Egypt that the far world and the terrestrial world are intimately and dynamically interlinked. We can be sure that beneath the Old Testament's apparent obsession with family descent, adultery, sin, violence, and the number of deaths in obscure battles lies an ancient teaching concerning the link between the terrestrial and divine worlds. But in this tradition, as it has been packaged for us by unknown early scribes, the link between the two worlds is portrayed as broken. Angelic beings with flaming swords block the entrance to the Garden of Eden. Jacob is not encouraged to climb the ladder of heaven. Now, it's interesting when you read, particularly in the New Testament, lots of references to sin. And now, that's one of those things that has several layers of meaning. And the outer layer is basically, don't do these things. These things are bad and they're immoral, and they will not lead to good things on earth. They will not lead to your own moral advancement if you do certain things, if you behave in a certain way. But in the original Greek, the term translated as sin is hamartano or harmatano. Harmatano probably is the accent. And harmatano was originally a term that came from archery. And it simply meant one thing. It was the factor that caused the archer to miss the target. Now, this meaning, the origin of the meaning of the Greek term that was translated as sin, I think has some rather interesting significance, particularly in discussing the question of archery, the idea of missing the target. See if you can remember that, because we'll come back to that when we start talking about the meaning of sin. Jacob's ladder, set upon the ground in a sacred place, also symbolizes another concept we've seen. The notion that there are special places where the far world and the terrestrial world are linked. Places that serve as the perfect conduit between the two worlds. Now, this is the thing that interests me. As a geologist, this is what really interests me. As the Parlez-vous suggests, the Grail, at least in part, would seem to be an experience of some kind. In his excursus on the Grail's curative properties and its power to ensure longevity, Wolfram would also seem to be implying something experiential as well as symbolic, a state of mind or a state of being. There seems little question that on one level, the Grail is an initiatory experience that in modern terminology would be described as a transformation or altered state of consciousness. Alternatively, it might be described as a Gnostic experience, a mystical experience, illumination, or union with God. It is possible to be even more precise and place the experiential aspect of the Grail in a very specific context. That context is the Kabbalah, or Kabbalistic thought. Certainly, such thought was much in the air at the time the Grail romances were composed. There was a famous Kabbalistic school at Toledo, for instance, where Kayat is said to have learned of the Grail. There were other schools at Girona, Montpellier, and elsewhere in the south of France. Now, that's something else. In enlisting during that incredible period of a half a century, that was another thing that was left off the list. The schools of Kabbalah that arose in southern France and Spain at that time and began disseminating teachings that had been kept secret for centuries. And this is an important link here that the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail are making for us, this connection now between the Grail literature and Kabbalah. Because once we begin to study into these Western esoteric traditions, we soon begin to realize that they're totally interconnected. The Kabbalah, the alchemy, the Hermetic wisdom, the Gnostic tradition, the Grail stories, they're all interconnected and are part of the same corpus of knowledge. There is no question that Wolfram does ascribe immense significance to a particular bloodline. If there is a single dominant theme pervading not only Parzival, but his other works as well, it is not so much the Grail as the Grail family, Indeed, the Grail family seems to dominate Wolfram's mind to an almost obsessive degree, and he devotes far more attention to them and their genealogy than to the mysterious object of which they are the custodians. Or could it be that the mysterious object of which they are custodians confers upon them some special quality that now can be passed on? And yes, undoubtedly watered down through successive generations, but perhaps the corpus of Grail knowledge gives us the specific information by which that quality can be reactivated from time to time, repotentized, so to speak. In many of the earlier manuscripts, the Grail is called the Sangreal, and even in the later version by Mallory, it is called the Sangreal. It is likely that some such form, Sangreal or Sangreal, was in fact the original one. It is also likely that that one word was subsequently broken in the wrong place. In other words, Sangreal or Sangreal may not have been intended to divide into Sangreal or Sangreal, but into Sangreal or Sangreal, or to employ the modern spelling, Sang-Royal or royal blood. Now, if you know your Kabbalistic methodology, you know the words were deliberately contrived to conceal multiple meanings. And so by the marriage of this meaning, the holy blood and the cup or the divine chalice, and linking those two by this word was the intent. For it does mean both. And it's simply a matter of how you break the word. So here are themes, qualities, symbolic associations with the Holy Grail. Number one, a cup, chalice, or cauldron. Two, the Eye of Thoth. Three, its connection with the crucifixion. Four, the idea of a universal medicine. Five, a man's head. Six, the blood or royal blood. And seven, a stone from heaven or a sapphire stone. Here's another more elaborate version of the 8 lists that I've done. This would be a good list. Who wants this list? All right. The chalice cup or cauldron or platter, also associated with the ritual of crucifixion. A man's head, a quest, something hidden or something lost. It also is associated with fertility of the landscape. For what happens to the landscape? What happens to the kingdom when the Grail is lost? If you read the literature, the kingdom is transformed into a wasteland. And we find the wasteland being a constant recurring theme throughout the Grail literature. And how is the wasteland restored to life and fertility? Well, this is the whole objective of the quest of the Grail, because until the Grail is found, the land cannot be brought back to life. The wasteland cannot be restored. And in the Grail literature, it is as if an enchantment has fallen over the land, which has rendered it impotent. And at the same time, the king has fallen into this malaise. We also see that it is a stone fallen from heaven, or a sapphire stone. It's associated with knights, with King Arthur, with the Round Table, and with the Templars. It's associated with the idea of rejuvenation or restoration, a universal medicine. It's connected with Joseph of Arimathea, with angels, and with the Eye of Thoth. Now, the task in delving into the meaning of this mystery is to how do you synthesize all of these disparate symbols into a coherent meaning. If you can do that, you may rediscover the secret.
Also, what you saw about a malaise coming over the land, it could be opposite of that, there was a positive effect on the land from the sacred sites, and that was lost when they no longer operated.
Well, it's a symbol of something lost,
Yeah.
right? Yes.
That brings that one.
In India, it's a common theme where there's like an ashram that a holy saint resides in, that has a tendency to bloom and become lush. It's a very common thing that when you start reading the literature.
Interesting, very interesting. I hope we have time to get to the stuff.
Where we got, you talked about on that stone, the sampler, but then you were talking a little about a lapis. Where is that coming?
Well, lapis exiles, I showed you the interpretation of it. It has several multiple interpretations, one of which is a stone falling from heaven. Lapis means stone. You know, like the word lapidary.
Lapis is sort of purplish blue.
Means blue stone.
Blue stone.
You got 20 minutes, Sarge.
We're running out of time. Quick, Don, I'm sorry.
That, you know, that picture of the rug, the Masonic rug.
Yeah.
Can we get back to that for just a second? There was one point that I wanted to bring up. All right, the directions. It's not like our map where we put the north on top.
Right.
It's got the east on top, and I know in Native American symbology that you pray the directions. The east is awakening, new beginnings, youth, enlightenment.
Right.
And they put the east on top. I don't know if that has any.
Yeah, and Masons do it too, as you can see here, because this carpet conforms to the layout of the Masonic Lodge. And the worshipful master who represents the sun is always placed in the east. So this carpet is laid out in the lodge so it's laid out to conform to the cardinal direction. Okay, let's go on. Sam says we've only got 20 minutes left. Tradition says, now this is from Charpentier, The Mysteries of Chartres Cathedral. Very good book. Tradition says that 3 tables bore the grail. What then was the grail? Now, this is in tradition. He's talking about the grail literature, of which I showed you the 10 extant examples. It appears for us in the Christian collection of romances of the Round Table, in which it is a cup that was used by Jesus at the Last Supper and by Joseph of Arimathea thereafter to collect Christ's blood during the crucifixion. We are concerned with a cup that contains the divine blood poured into it directly or transmuted. The quest of the Knights of the Round Table, here we have yet another table, was for the hidden cup. Legend says the cup was kept in the castle adventurous of the Fisher King, and the word grail is itself Celtic. Its origin is not for all that certainly Celtic. It may well be very much earlier. I believe that this word derives from the root car or gar, which has the meaning of stone. The gar-al or gar-el, the urn that contains the stone, or the stone urn, say the stone of God. The two etymologies are in fact very close. In the first case, we should be concerned with a vessel in which the stone becomes, in the second, with the stone itself. The symbol is unquestionably alchemical. In practice, we cannot separate the word grail from the word cauldron. In early Celtic times, it was in the cauldron of loo that universal medicines were cooked over a special fire. Moreover, King Gradlon's name indicated that it was a guardian of the grail who was engulfed in his town of Is, when his Christian daughter destroyed the menhirs that marked the fields. Now that's very interesting in the context of what we were just talking about, and with Bill's remark that he just made. The menhirs are these standing stones that, according to popular legend, are always associated with fertility and are symbols of fertility. And therefore, to the early Christians, these are bad because it makes us think about sex and things like that we don't want to think about. So here, she destroyed the menhirs. So what happened? Well, it caused consequences that people believed were associated. This is a historical example where destruction of the menhirs led to bad consequences in the climate and the weather and the drought and so forth. Grail is a Celtic word, but one comes across the legend of the sacred cup under other names in other places and times. Melchizedek is represented in the north door of Chartres, known as the door of the initiates, holding a cup that he hands to Abraham and from which the stone protrudes. Under whatever name, it invariably designates a vessel whose contents are taking their part of divinity, are penetrated with it, are in the process of transmutation. One sees a very fine Christian illustration of this on the wall of the church of Saint-Luc-de-Nude, near Provence. St. Luke stands there holding a chalice in which an emerald brought by an angel is materializing. The symbolism could hardly be clearer. And here's Melchizedek and Abraham on the north portal of Chartres. And here is the cup, the vessel of Lou that holds the grail, which is seen protruding from it, the stone which is protruded from the cup, which he is in the process of handing off to Abraham right here. You see that Abraham has his son here, Isaac is the sacrifice, and down here he stands on the head of the ram, which is the symbol of Aries. Again, we have the astrological symbolism that's always ever present. So what is the connection then between the legend of Melchizedek and the grave? It is a question of alchemy. Alchemy, one knows, is the art and science of gathering, fixing, and concentrating the vital current that bathes the worlds and is responsible for all life. It is a concentration that adepts succeed in effecting, and which they establish on a supporting base. It is called the Philosopher's Stone. This stone works because of the concentration very powerfully and enables the adept to bring about in everything an evolution that would otherwise take long centuries, if not millennia, to unfold in nature. Notably, and this is the test, the metamorphosis of base metals into silver or gold. Now, here's another idea of what the alchemical process is supposed to achieve. The Philosopher's Stone accelerates the natural evolutionary process. It's an accelerant that somehow, when imbibed by the philosopher, allows that philosopher to leapfrog over the normal, long drawn-out processes of evolutionary transmutation. The idea of the transformation of base metals into silver or gold was not the objective of alchemy. It was merely the test of potency that showed that conveyed that the stone was able to now be consumed by the philosopher. That it was now potentized and ready for consumption. But the vital current, the spiritus mundi, spirit of the world among alchemists, works without check on everything in which it is bringing about evolution, man included. Let it be admitted that in certain places, because of a concentration of the vital stream, such evolutionary action may be stepped up, the more so as man becomes receptive. And it is this result, a kind of mutation, that is sought and obtained in pilgrimage. Now here we're having an important influence of ideas. Again, this idea, the concentration of a vital stream that might be occurring in certain places. We get back to this idea that there are certain loci or certain centers that might have certain qualities or properties whereby there could be affected this concentration of the spiritus mundi, the spirit of the world, and now available to somebody who now knows how to partake of it, who has the means and the ability to partake of it.
Thought of another very important factor, sacred springs. There's your cup, there's your water.
But what knowledge must they have had, these creators and builders, to achieve the realization at this stage of such instruments of action? One can easily see that this pile of stone, he's talking about a Gothic cathedral build, so taut, according to Claudel, that you could make it ring with a fingernail, is a replica of the dolmen. That's that standing stone, and initiates its use of the telluric currents. And as in the dolmen, the edifice is connected with water through the well that existed originally at the level of the choir in every cathedral. Now, this again is a very important geological connection. All of the cathedrals were placed over springs or water courses or the convergence of underground water. And this apparently seems to be, remember in our discussion about the earthworks, the great earthworks of North America, what do we find? Every single one example of we saw is associated with flowing water or springs, right? Flowing water or springs in virtually every example. Telluric, that's a term used to apply to this current of the, to telluric means of the earth. So it means this quality or energy of the earth.
Why is there a why do you have a concentration of energies that lasts for, say, 150 years? Then all of a sudden it just dies. And it may be 500, 600, 700 years before the energy all concentrates again. What causes this?
Well, if you read your Reichian, it's, you know, it's the whole process. It's accumulation, charge, and then discharge. And then a reaccumulation and a discharge. It may be reflected into, you know, how seismic energy.
Like a Leyden jar then.
Yes, or you have seismic energy building up along a fault line and then it's released. And then, or you have subterranean volcanic energy building up and then it's released, relieves the pressure, and now it begins to accumulate once again. What it appears is that when we begin to look at this infrastructure of the ancient sacred architecture was that what we're seeing here are components within some kind of a system, some kind of a technological system, whereby the spiritus mundi, the telluric currents, this subtle energies could somehow be, as in the words of the alchemists, could be concentrated and fixed and multiplied and then be perhaps utilized once they had reached a certain level of potency or concentration. But there is more than this to a cathedral. It lifts itself into the air, it plunges, and for this cause it is made very high in aerial currents, rain from the sky, atmospheric storms, the great cosmic streams. It gathers, absorbs, and transmits light. Earth, water, air, and fire. What better crucible has there ever been for the finest of human alchemies? For it is certainly a question of alchemy, the transmutation not of metal, but of man whom it is wished to lead to a higher state of humanity. But that it may be effective, the instrument must be adapted to earth, heaven, and man himself. In those obscure times, and they were that. Whence could the knowledge come? The Cathedral of Chartres stands on an eminence whose history remains in many respects mysterious. In Christian times, it was one of the most sought-after places of pilgrimage in France. But before that, the Gauls went there in crowds, and still earlier, the whole Celtic world, even from beyond the Rhine. Pilgrims of the Christian era, those of the great pilgrimage who came from the East, went up singing psalms to do homage to Our Lady of Under the Earth, the Black Virgin in whose honor they had taken the pilgrim's staff and cape. Next, they went in procession by a passage on the north side which leads to a crypt to visit a grotto underneath the church where the sacred statue was to be seen. There were many examples of these black Madonnas, usually carved out of some black stone like black onyx. There was one in the grotto underneath Chartres when the Romans arrived 300 years before Christ. And it was showing a mother with child, except that it was labeled as being an effigy of Isis. And it was taken out of the grotto and removed into the cathedral. And somewhere, I think in the 1600s, a superstitious bishop had it destroyed because he wanted to obscure the connections between Mary and Isis. We will go on here, but we'll see that the counterpart here is Isis with the infant Horus, which is carried over into the Christian symbolism of the Madonna with child. We're running out of time, but very important symbolism going on here, particularly in her headdress. And we will come back to that. We will not spend any time on this for tonight. We'll come back to that. This is Mary Magdalene praying in the garden, and the skull by her knees. This is in the church of Rennes Chateau. Some very interesting symbolism going on here, and also some rather interesting depictions of landscape features, which we will save. We'll come back to that. In Chartres Cathedral, there's a pillar. Here are two dragons drinking from the Grail cup. What in the world does this represent? The two dragons drinking from the Grail cup. From Maranatha et in Arcadia Ego, very obscure work, which is written in code. To all the guardians of heaven was this immortal knowledge known, even to the Promethean serpents that revealed the truth of the great tree, and to the fallen king of terrors who waged war against its very essence. Then seek the meaning of the staff of Tiresias, the relic of Hermes. Through its power it transmuted that which it touched beyond the value of gold. For 7 years it solidified the entwined serpents of Sarman and Sarmoon, until, as with the mortal frame, the power restored that flesh through the value of gold. Now,
7 years.
7 years it takes for the whole process to effect itself. Now, what is the staff of Tiresias, the relic of Hermes? For 7 years, it solidified the entwined serpents of Sarman and Sarmoon. Who or what does that mean? The entwined
Yep.
serpents.
Caduceus.
The DNA.
Absolutely, of course. Because that's the alchemical secret, isn't it?
But it takes,
Something that
it takes
affects,
7 years to make a total 100% swap
yeah,
of everything in the human body.
yep. So here we go. All right, so we're not gonna have time. This will be just part one tonight, and next week we're gonna go further into the Grail. What do we got, about 5 minutes left?
Next week or two.
I'll give you 5 minutes.
2 weeks.
Break it short.
Fulcanelli, 1937, quoted in Morning of the Magicians by Jacques Bergier. I shall not attempt to prove to you what I am now going to say, but I ask you to repeat it to M. Hellbronner. Certain geometrical arrangements of highly purified materials are enough to release atomic forces without having recourse to either electricity or vacuum techniques. We'll pick up on this story. We've been talking about Fulcanelli in here, right?
Biological transmutation.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Here's Lawrence Gardner talking about the platinum group metals. We'll come back to that. Because here's what we have to remember. The platinum group metals seem to be a key component within the alchemical recipe. Where do the platinum group metals come from?
Ground.
Well,
Rocks
yes.
that fell from the sky.
When discussing the Urim and the Thummim earlier, we touched upon the subject of iridium crystal. Before progressing to the nature of the Highward Firestone, it is necessary to look a little more circumspectly at iridium and other platinum group metals, since they are central to understanding the along with platinum, the other 5 PGMs are iridium, palladium, rhodium, osmium, and ruthenium. Because of the ultimate strengths of the metals, they are now used in surgical, optical, and dental instruments, crucibles and thermocouples, machine bearings, electrical switch contacts, and all manner of precision devices down to the tipping of needles and pen nibs. It is generally cited in encyclopedias and reference books that PGMs came to our attention as late as the 19th century, and perhaps the best known is palladium. Used extensively by jewelers, palladium is often alloyed with gold to produce the metal popularly known as white gold. It is said that palladium was first discovered in Brazil, California, and the Urals in 1803. It was named after the asteroid Pallas, or link there. Iridium, osmium, and rhodium are also given the same date of recognition, with ruthenium following in 1843. However, it is now plain from discoveries relating to the distant BC years that the ancients were fully aware of the individual properties of these platinum group metals. Now, when you, again, ponder the idea and recognize the idea that the platinum group metals are delivered to Earth from space, you begin to see, I mean, to me, what is one of the central clues of the whole cosmic mystery, the whole cosmic technology that we're trying to resurrect here. Somehow these metals must interact on some level within this transmutatory process. These metals come from space. Picture the image of the dove delivering the wafer, the concentrated package into the cup. Keep that image in your mind as you're thinking about this. Iridium crystal glows with transparent color like any precious gemstone. Think of the word iridescent. The name iridium was applied in 1803 by virtue of this very iridescence from the Latin iris, which means rainbow. Brought to earth by meteorites. Now remember, in the Grail story, the Grail was brought to earth by angels. Brought to earth by meteorites, iridium is an extraterrestrial metal which can form its own rare glass-like rock, which the ancients called sapphire. This was the Shethion, or stone of heaven, said to have been present beneath the Jerusalem temple, as identified in the old tenets of Royal Arch Freemasonry. Iridium is a very rare element on Earth, but geologists have discovered its existence in quantities up to 30 times the norm in crust layers where meteorites containing the substance have landed in the distant past. The Sumerians and ancient Egyptians clearly knew about the properties of gold and how to alloy it with other noble metals. The master craftsmen were adepts too in the workings of PGMs, which, just like gold, could be taken to the exotic highward state of the Shem Ana, or this means that they not only knew and worked with these metals, but they also pioneered the science of atoms and nuclei. In Royal Arch symbolism, we find this, the checkerboard floor, the altar. Sitting on the altar is what artifact? Ark of the Covenant. We see the two angels with their wings connected. Over that, we see a circle, a wafer with the pentacle on it, the interlaced pentagon. And then we see the arch. And the arch what we're seeing is an uncompleted work here, an unfinished work. The keystone that the builders rejected. Remember that reference. It's going to be an important one in 2 weeks. And we see that the keystone is about to be inserted into the arch. And when it does, it will complete the circuit. Do I have to quit now, Sam?
Try to quit.
Okay. We'll quit right here. And this will be part 1 and part 2 of the Holy Grail will be 2 weeks.
Thank you.